including me, including Dr. Harris, we are always learning. And there is it's important to be, willing and ready to learn and ask questions. So please, without further ado, I'm going to have Dr. Harris introduce himself. And if you do have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. And every once in a while, if you don't mind, Dr. Harris, I'll just kind of stop you when I start to see questions piling up, unless you want me to wait till the end, however you want.
No, I'm completely comfortable with that. So just stop me when you feel like it's a good place to do so. And if you find that we have questions that are clustering around a particular theme, then I'm happy to address those as well. Professor Casares, can I ask you before I begin,
Yes.
How much time, what time do we need to end today?
You have until 6.
Okay, perfect. And may I share my screen?
Yes, let me do that for you now. Hold on, please.
Okay. And while Professor Casares is allowing me to transitioning me to co-host, if the space that I'm in looks a little young for me, it's my son's room. I kind of took over his space because he's just got a better setup than I do, working remotely with kids and a partner who also works. It's space can be a premium. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll begin. All right, so good evening, everyone. First and foremost, thank you all for having me. Thank you, Professor Casares, for providing me this space and this platform to share some of my work and talk about how we may intersect the important work that you and your students are doing. As Professor Casares shared, I'm Frank Harris III. I'm a professor in the College of Education at San Diego State. I'm in my 14th year here as a professor, and I can't believe it's been that long. I also co-direct a research center called the Community College Equity Assessment Lab. Long story short, the work that we do at SEAL, which we call it, is to partner with community colleges to institutionalize equity. And I'm going to give you a sense of what we mean by equity and what institutionalization of equity looks like in some context. And I will say this, although my work and my expertise lies within the context of education, I think we'll find that because education and health and public health are both a part of the helping professions, a lot of the issues that we seek to address are very similar, and a lot of the strategies and the ways in which we approach it are also similar. And so I think there's some things that I can learn from you all as public health professionals, and hopefully you'll find that some of the things that I have to share today are value added to your work and your development as you prepare to enter the field. So the objectives that I've prepared for today are fairly straightforward. We'll talk about issues of racism and racial equity and inclusion and some of the other concepts that Professor Casares shared with us earlier. I will say this is that my focus as a scholar and even as a practitioner tends to prioritize issues related to racial equity, and I'll talk about why that is and why that's important. That being said, I think we find that a lot of the issues that we'll discuss today have broader implications beyond racial equity as well. We'll talk about systemic barriers and issues, things that get in the way, things that make it difficult for us to address persistent and long-standing racial disparities in public health. And then perhaps most importantly, we'll end with some strategies that we can all apply in our work to think about how can we be effective and equity-minded and race-conscious public health professionals. And now, of course, I'll explain what that means shortly. I think I've already used the word equity maybe 10 times already. And so I never like to assume or take for granted that we all have a shared understanding of what equity means. In our work and the work that we do in education, I think it would be similar in public health. Equity does have an intentional focus on addressing what we call disproportionate impact, right? Meaning that there's some groups, in the case of education, there's some students who are not benefiting as much from their participation in post-secondary education as much as other students. One can be disproportionately impacted both in terms of outcomes as well as experiences, and I'll talk about what that means shortly. And then the other point I want to make here is that when we look at most indicators of success, right, whether it's educational success or health and wellness, we find that there are certain groups or certain populations that are consistently disproportionately impacted. I do want to highlight two things here before I move on from this, is that this is by no means an exhaustive list. So I know that there's certainly other groups that could easily be presented here and represented here. So by no means am I saying these are the only groups that are disproportionately impacted. At the same time, and I'm sure some of you who are very astute and aware, you probably recognize that there's an incredible amount of intersectionality that exists even amongst the handful of groups that are represented here, right? And so, for example, someone can be racially minoritized and also a former foster youth and also experience a basic needs insecurity and so forth. And so I just want to be mindful of that. Before I continue, also, quick side note, I'm happy, if it's okay with you, Professor Casares, I'd be happy to share the entire slide deck after the presentation for you and your students if you all would like to have it.
That would be great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. And so we cannot talk about equity without talking about its companion concept, which we call equity mindedness. And equity mindedness is a state of mind, it's a mindset. And in many ways, it's the ways in which we as health professionals, educators, bring equity to life, right? And equity mindedness is primarily comprised of the 5 characteristics that we see represented here. The first is that we have to be systemically aware. So when we look at disproportionate impact in education, it's the same people, the same populations that are also not well served in our healthcare system, in our workforce, in our justice system, and so forth. And so when we're dealing with inequity, we're really dealing with a systemic issue that has implications for almost every social institution that impacts the lives and experiences of those who are disproportionately impacted, as well as their family and loved ones. We have to be racially conscious and racially affirming. I'm going to talk about that maybe a slide or two from now. We have to look at these issues from the perspective of institutional responsibility and accountability. And what that means is that when we have a population or a family or a person that is experiencing a health disparity, traditionally, we've always asked, well, what's wrong with that community, right? Or what's wrong with that family? Or what's wrong with that client? And what we have to do is reframe the way we look at these issues and first ask, well, what's wrong with our communities that are serving them? Or what's wrong with our schools? Or what's wrong with our healthcare system, right? And then we have to start there when it comes to identifying solutions and ways to address the problem. We have to also, as a part of this system, right, whether you're an educator or a healthcare professional, you have to assume some personal accountability and responsibility. And then you have to really care about people. You have to care about the people you're serving, and not just care about them in a casual sense, but really care about them in a deep and intentional sense. This issue of equity and equity mindedness is also very much aligned with a theory that has actually emerged from the nursing literature. So it was a group of nursing scholars who came up with this concept called a culture of care. And it has really made its way into education. And so we hear about it. And, we have some colleagues that are working it into their practice with students. But essentially, a culture of care essentially says that care is the foundation of healing, right? So as an educator, right, if I'm really focused on making sure that my students and the students who I'm serving are able to learn and able to maximize their learning potential, it first starts with me caring about them and caring about their success. And this culture of care theory, in many ways, talks about the same thing, right? That we, as healthcare professionals, there can be no healing without caring, right? That care is the foundation of what we have to do and how we have to approach our work, as healthcare professionals. And then moving on also is the notion of equity mindedness. and race consciousness, which I know, right now we're living in a very racially salient time in our country's history. Race has always been a salient concept or salient construct, I should say, in our society. But I think, more recently, since the murders of people like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others, that we sort of see the implications of systemic racial oppression and what it means, and the consequences of it. And I think for us, if we're going to be equity-minded healthcare professionals, we also have to be race conscious. And what that means is that it doesn't mean that other forms of oppression and discrimination are not important. But what it also means is that we cannot substitute other forms of oppression and discrimination in a way that allows us to skirt around or not address racial equity. And historically, there always seems to be a lot of reluctance and a lot of discomfort in having transparent conversations about race and how does race intersect our work, in my case as an educator, and in some of your cases as healthcare professionals. But if we're going to really achieve racial equity, which is an important goal, then we have to be transparent in making connections and embracing and acknowledging the consequences of being a racially minoritized person in our society and what that means. Taking this conversation further, when we think about the experiences of Black and Indigenous people in our country, right? We know that there are some longstanding racial inequities that have typically gone largely unaddressed for decades, if not longer. This is, again, just by no means an exhaustive list, but when we look at things like the Flint water crisis as an example, right, of how, Black and Indigenous people of color are heavily concentrated in communities with chronic environmental hazards and fewer resources that promote good health. So things like parks and recreation centers and health food markets. We also know, for example, that Blacks and Latinos, as an example, comprise about 29% of the US population, but account for 57% of those who are incarcerated. With regard to education, right, my area of focus, in 2016, about 30% of Blacks between ages of 25 and 34 held bachelor's degrees. Comparatively, about 50% of whites in this age bracket held bachelor's degrees. Taking this conversation further, in 2018, the poverty rate for Blacks and Native Americans were 22% and 24% respectively, compared to 9% for whites during the same time frames. That our Black and Latinx families are less likely to be homeowners than their white counterparts. And then we also know that there are a multitude of health disparities that plague communities of color, which are highlighted here in this next slide. And as a quick sidebar, I know some of you, and I was sort of privy to the conversation earlier about where might we find health data that speaks about issues related to COVID and social determinants of health and so forth. And there's a couple of citations in the presentation that I'll share that might provide a useful starting point as you all work together and start to put together your projects. But again, I'm not going to read all these, but I do want to highlight some notable health disparities, and how race and ethnicity are a point of disproportionate impact in this regard. And then, taking this conversation even further, I put some data from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Actually, I have to say that these are data that I pulled back in August, and I didn't update them. And to be honest, the reason why I didn't is because I was sort of depressed and wasn't looking forward to seeing how much the numbers have grown, because we know, again, this was back when we had less than 100,000 COVID-related deaths in the country. I know we've far exceeded that in a very short amount of time. But what we have here are the percentages of Black, Latinx, and whites who have suffered deaths as a result of the pandemic. And we see that these data are disaggregated by age. And what I did to sort of make things a little bit easier is I highlighted in red the groups with the highest death rate and the lowest death rates in green. And as we can see, for each of the four age ranges, Black and Latinx communities had the higher rates of death within each age range. And so, again, all of this speaks to a larger issue around health disparities, around systemic racism, and further underscores the need why we need to approach our work as health professionals, as educators, as public health professionals, however we define ourselves or identify ourselves. We have to look at these issues from an equity-minded and race-conscious perspective in order to really have some impact in closing these disparities. I also want to make sure, so I know the word racism and the word racist are two constructs that are often dominating our discourse, especially now in the midst of this very intense election cycle that we find ourselves in. And I think it's really important to make sure that we have a shared understanding of what racism is and how it operates. And ultimately, how does it have some impact on some of the outcomes, some that we've talked about today and many others that we haven't. And so what I'm going to do is borrow heavily from the work of Dr. Ibram Kendi, who wrote the brilliant scholar who wrote the brilliant book, How to Be Anti-Racist. I think it's one of those books when I read it, I'm like, wow, I wish I would have written this. This is so well done. But anyway, what Kendi tells us is that when we have racial inequities, right, like many of the ones that we've just spent the last 5 minutes or so discussing, that those racial inequities don't just happen, right? Doesn't just happen by chance and doesn't just happen by circumstances, but ultimately they're the result of racist policies. And so we often think about policies in a very formal way, right? Like laws and executive orders. But for the purposes of our conversation today, I want us to think about policies both in formal and informal ways, because we know sometimes an informal policy, one that's not written but that's widely practiced, can have a profound influence on people's lives. And so we also know, and what Kendi tells us again, is that when we have racist policies that are actually justified by racist ideas, this is how we end up with the racial inequities that are plaguing our communities, from a health perspective, from an education perspective, from an economic perspective, from almost any perspective that we look at. And it's not just that we have racist ideas, right? But again, it's that these racist ideas are often used to justify racist policies. And so I know someone there is saying, okay, well, Dr. Harris, what exactly does that look like? What do you mean by that? Can you give me some examples of what you're talking about here? And so what I have, right, just to walk us through here, these are three racial inequities that have been in our, in our country, in our society for an incredibly long time, right? We see significant disparities in our education system, in the accumulation of wealth that comes with like owning property, and in the justice system as a result of certain racist policies and ideas, right? So for example, the attainment gap when it comes to education was ultimately the outcome of the racist policy, school segregation. And I know some folks may say, well, Frank, we don't really have school segregation, right? Well, I would say that, we have what's called de facto school segregation. So yeah, it's not necessarily a written policy like it used to be, but it's still widely practiced, right? And so that's how we ultimately end up with something like the attainment gap, right? The educational attainment gap. The wealth gap is justified by the racist policy of redlining, right? And redlining was the idea that it was something that was, a policy that was practiced as early as the 30s, maybe even before that, basically said, for banks, we're not going to give mortgage loans to people of color, right? Which had a huge impact, again, on people of color being able to buy property and buy land. In earlier times, decades ago, it was farming land. Today it's become, more so connected to owning real estate, things of that nature. And then we have the justice gap, which is justified by the racist policy of mass incarceration, which again, sort of really made its way late 70s, early 80s with the war on drugs and the crack epidemic and so forth. Now, all of these racist policies had to be justified by a set of racist ideas. So for example, school segregation was justified by the racist idea that Black and indigenous people of color, for example, are intellectually inferior to whites. And so what that means is that, so they don't deserve schools of equal quality and certainly shouldn't be educated in the same spaces as whites. That was a racist idea that justified that racist policy. Still does in some ways. Redlining is rooted in the idea that communities of color are not financially responsible and that an investment in them and their communities comes with significant financial risk for lenders. And then mass incarceration stems from the idea that communities of color are more likely than whites to commit violent crimes, and therefore we need to have policies that allow law enforcement to police them more aggressively than they would whites, and sentencing laws that allow judges to incarcerate them for longer periods of time, both of which have contributed to mass incarceration, right? And so I'm sharing all of this to say that it's not enough for us to just recognize racial inequities, right? We have to be able to engage in critical analyses, right? Understanding and sort of asking ourselves, well, what are the policy implications of this racial inequity, right? Why is it that COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on communities of color, right? Well, there was racist policies that were justified by racist ideas that allows that disparity to exist and persist. This is probably a good time for me to pause and ask, are there questions, thoughts, comments, anything that I can share, anything that I can clarify before we continue? Is any of this making sense?
I had a question.
Yes. Yep.
How do you appropriately, like for example, like in a school space, if you see, not this professor, just like another professor, like for example, using specific terminology like that are racist or using specific words, and you know that these are not terms that should be used to describe certain groups of people, how do you appropriately or respectfully acknowledge and bring this up to them in a school space or like in any professional space?
So you mean from the perspective, appreciate the question, thank you. From the perspective, like if I'm a student in that professor's class?
Yes, correct. Like I just believe that any professor in a place of influence, it's so much more important that we use correct, appropriate, and inclusive language. That's also, of course, not racist language. And so as a student, like what do you do in those situations when that is not being, taught in such a way?
I think that's a good question because I would agree with your perspective. I think it was Lena was the name. I would agree with your perspective that as educators, as healthcare professionals, as police officers, as social workers, we are held or should be held to a higher standard when it comes to cultural competency and enacting behaviors and practices and using language that is inclusive, that's welcoming, that's not racist and so forth. But we also know that is, that is not often the case. Far too often it's not. And so I think as from the perspective of, first of all, I think it shouldn't be a student's responsibility to have to educate and correct a professor or any educator on this, right? I think an educator, should be held accountable. First, it should start with some self-accountability. But if you find yourself in a situation where that's not happening, I think it's, I would be careful to directly call out the professor because that could have some implications on your relationship with that professor. That it could have some implications on how you assess and evaluate it. And so I think it's important to know what other resources you have available. Do you have an assistant dean that you can go to? Could you go to the department chair? But, and of course, if you feel as though you have a relationship with this professor that would allow you to be comfortable approaching them, then I would, I guess, say by all means do so. But I would be very careful in doing so, just because there's already a little bit of a power dynamic there that could be consequential. And so, but again, I don't think it should be left up to students to do this. I think institutions have a responsibility to make sure that the professors are being hired, that they're being hired with the recognition and understanding of, you know, why they have to be equity minded and culturally competent and all the things that we're talking about today. If we're doing a good job as an institution to assess folks before they're hired, then the likelihood of that happening is, you know, is hopefully reduced. Maybe one more
Thank you
question.
for that response. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, I know definitely that like there's like expectations and whatnot, but it's unfortunate like when it's the reality of things and students are put in position. I definitely not want to just sit on things like this. I really appreciate your response on that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe one more. Okay, we'll continue, and if we'll have other opportunities for questions and dialogue and discussion. I also want to introduce you all to this concept that you may or may not have heard of, but it's called racial battle fatigue. Actually, if you can give me a thumbs up if you've ever heard of the concept of racial battle fatigue, that would be awesome, or put it in the chat. But essentially, racial battle fatigue, there's a colleague, William Smith, who's a professor at the University of Utah, who's done a lot of important work recently on racial battle fatigue. And I find this framework to be incredibly illuminating because what it does is it helps us recognize the cumulative effects of chronic racism. And what Smith argues is that racism is not just something that happens ever so often to people of color, right? It's actually something that affects nearly every aspect of our lived experiences. And so, you know, because the effects of racism are enduring, they actually become a part of our life history, right? So, for example, you would be hard pressed to ask a Black person to describe what is it like to be a Black person without them somehow talking about how racism has had some impact on their identity. Smith also likens racial battle fatigue to another phenomenon known as combat stress syndrome. And combat stress syndrome is what soldiers who are in combat zones experience as a result of being immersed in high-risk environments where the threat of being attacked is ever present. And so what Smith argues is that people of color in schools, in communities, in our healthcare system and so forth, experience a range of both physiological symptoms like you see here, and psychological symptoms that can be directly attributed to chronic racism, right? And so what he also says is that unfortunately, these symptoms are often misdiagnosed or erroneously attributed to factors other than racialized stress. But as educators and as emerging healthcare professionals, we have to understand that racism is not just something that, you know, people experience for a moment, and that, you know, after they've cooled off and they've had a conversation with someone, they've kind of, you know, blown it off, that the effects are no longer there. But when you're constantly dealing with racism and racial microaggressions, which I'm going to talk about in the very next slide, when your experiences of racism are chronic, then it actually has both physiological and psychological consequences that affect your healthy well-being, right? And as healthcare professionals, we have to recognize that and understand that, because it's not really a part of most of our training or the socialization that we get as we enter the field, right? And while you know, some of us may understand, yeah, you know, someone struggling with anxiety or someone struggling with you know, other mental health concerns or issues, we don't often attribute them to racialized stress. And so what I would encourage everyone to do is to, you know, as you transition, as you continue to learn and study and prepare to be a healthcare professional, a public health professional, make sure you're paying attention to issues like racial battle fatigue and how that may come into play in the context in which you're working and supporting clients. The ways in which we've talked about racism so far, I think would lead one to believe that racism is always sort of in your face, easy to recognize, and is very transparent. But I think it's important to understand that racism often doesn't operate in that way. And that's where the issue of racial microaggressions really comes into play. It's something that has really been a focus of our work as educators, because racial microaggressions are incredibly prevalent. To offer a definition of what they are, right? You see them presented here on the screen. But racial microaggressions are the brief and commonplace verbal, behavior, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. Racial microaggressions, much like racial battle fatigue, is pervasive in the sense that people of color and other minority groups experience them on an almost daily basis. They can be expressed verbally, or non-verbally, or environmentally, which I'll provide some examples of shortly. But here's the key point here. Regardless of how they're expressed, what we know about racial microaggressions is that they invalidate the experiences and the intellectual capabilities of people of color, and we'll talk more about what that means and what that looks like shortly. The second point is this: it's because racial microaggressions are often expressed subtly, it's often difficult to know what someone really thinks or feels when they're on the receiving end of one, right? So for example, if a physician says to a client, wow, I didn't expect you to know what that was or what that means, right? Or a physician microaggresses a client. Sometimes the client is not always clear about what has happened, right? And they often sort of engage in what I call, mental gymnastics and trying to figure out, well, what exactly did the person mean when they said that, right? And why would they say that about me, right? And what do they think about me and who I am, and so forth. And it's because of this uncertainty that often surrounds a microaggression. Some researchers say that racial microaggressions can actually be more psychologically damaging than overt acts of racism. Because with overt acts of racism, there's no need to second guess or wonder how a person feels about you. Whereas with racial microaggressions, this is often not the case. And so again, I'm not here to debate and to say, hey, which one is worse. What I want to do is make sure you have some recognition and understanding of what they are and how they operate and what the consequences of them are. Also, because of the uncertainty that can surround a racial microaggression and the fear of retaliation, it can often be very difficult to address them, right? And why is that? Because most people, especially those who work in a helping profession, like healthcare, like education, or so forth, they really see themselves as good people who care about the well-being of others. And so they can respond with defensiveness when they're accused of microaggressing someone. And there's a tendency to see oneself as a victim and blame the person who has been microaggressed as offending them. But here's what we have to understand is that most of us, and myself included, I'm a part of what I'm about to say, has likely been microaggressed at some point and has been on the receiving end, has microaggressed someone and been on the receiving end of a microaggression at some point. And so in many ways, we can think about this as being and interacting in a social world. And when we accept this, it's perhaps a little bit easier to accept accountability for our microaggressions. And we'll talk about strategies and how do we address it, towards the end of this presentation. It's also important to know and recognize that microaggressions can be expressed in many different ways. We already know that they can be expressed both verbally and non-verbally, right? And we see some examples there. And I also have the, by verbal, I mean someone could actually say something, or someone could actually type something in a text message or on a discussion board, which actually makes it even harder to sort of work through and identify these things. I think this textual medium makes it even more difficult. But they can also be environmental, such as a racist image or a meme that's shared. And so they can also be expressed in public, like in the presence of a large group of people, like, the space in which we're engaged here today. Or they could also be expressed privately, right? Such as between two people, or a client and a therapist. And so the way that a microaggression is expressed often has some influence on the actions that we can take to address them. And again, we're going to talk about what some of those actions might be as we move forward into the presentation. But here's what you have to understand. to really understand the influence of a microaggression, you have to get a sense of what's the underlying message that's communicated. And so with microaggressions, it's usually not what's said, right? But it's always the underlying message. What's underneath the message is what makes it really challenging. And that's sort of where the impact of a microaggression tends to lie. And so for people of color, the messages that are communicated by way of a racial microaggression are very consistent. And these are some examples of what some of those underlying messages are. Again, I won't read them all, but you can take a look at them. And we're going to talk about, you know, some different types of microaggressions that speak to these issues. We have also found is that microaggressions tend to fall in one of three different categories. Micro insults, which offend someone on the basis of their identity or their culture. Micro invalidations, which belittle or disregard someone's experience. And micro assaults, which are actually not presented on the slide, because micro assaults are actually more consistent with overt acts of racism, such as like expressing a racial slur towards someone. And unlike micro insults and unlike micro invalidations, both of which are presented on the slide, micro assaults are not subtle at all. They're very intentional and very transparent. And so we won't talk about micro assaults, during our time together today, but I do want to, at least highlight and let you know that they are the third category of microaggressions. We're going to talk about three different types of microaggressions. We don't have time to really talk about all of these, but I highlight these three because these are the ones that we find that tend to be most commonly expressed in our work in education. And I would imagine that there's a lot of consistency and overlap between what folks experience outside of education, such as in the context of public health. And so we'll talk about these three, and then we'll also talk about some different ways in which we can address them. But the first is what we call an assumption of criminality. An assumption of criminality occurs when a person of color is viewed as dangerous, a thug, or someone who is likely to commit a crime based on their identity. There are some examples here. Most of these examples, actually all of them for the most part, come from the context of education. Just a little bit of a heads up, a few slides from now, I'm going to ask you to perhaps offer some examples of how some of these microaggressions manifest in the context of public health. But just to give you an example of what we see in education, these are some examples here. The second type of microaggression that we'll talk about is called pathologizing culture. And pathologizing culture occurs when a person, when people make derogatory statements about communities of color, or assume that people who come from communities of color are not value added to certain contexts, right? There's several examples that we see here, right? Again, none of these come from, none of these are things that I've made up. These are all things that have emerged from, a long body of research that I've had the opportunity to conduct. The one that I really want to highlight here is the fourth one on the list here. And some of you may actually recognize this statement because this isn't a verbatim quote, but our Surgeon General, right, at the outset of the COVID outbreak, made a similar statement about Black communities and basically saying that, hey, and by the way, the Surgeon General is an African-American man. And he said, part of why we're having these disparities with regard to COVID-related infections and deaths in our Black communities, because, we need Black communities to make healthier choices and, to lay off the cigarettes and lay off the booze or something to that effect, right? And he received a lot of criticism from that because that was an example of pathologizing culture. And the reason why I pointed out that the Surgeon General was African-American, because we often assume that, only folks who identify as white can microaggress someone on the basis of race. And I think sometimes we have to recognize is that because race is a systemic issue, that, you know, sometimes, right, even people of color can become complicit in our own oppression at times. We can buy into the stereotypes about our own communities, the negative stereotypes about our own communities, and end up microaggressing people from our communities. The last one here is what we call a description of intelligence. And obviously this is one that's very, very prevalent within the context of education, but I think we can see how it could also manifest within health, public health as well. But this is basically when we assign a degree of intelligence, or we devalue or disregard someone's intellectual capabilities on the basis of race. These, again, and there's some examples that you see represented here on the slide. I won't read them to you. But what I would like to do at this time is ask folks to take a couple minutes. We have, again, description of intelligence, pathologizing culture, and assumption of criminality are the big three that we see here. But what might be an example of the ways in which a description of intelligence can be manifested in the context of public health? Can someone just, again, take a half a minute to think about that? And if someone has a good example they'd like to share, I would invite you just to unmute yourself and go ahead and share it. And just to give a heads up, I'm also going to ask the same question about pathologizing culture and assumption of criminality as well. But description of intelligence, how might it manifest in public health, if at all?
I've experienced a couple of times where I'm in a very specific field of public health, and people who are in that field respond to me saying, "Oh, how did you get interested in this?" or "How did you get involved in this? Like, this isn't something that people not like you are interested in." And most of the time it gets passed off as young, but there are often other assumptions that I think there are made.
Thank you, Matthew. So you don't necessarily attribute it to your age. Are there other salient aspects of your identity that you might attribute this to?
Yeah, I'm Hispanic, and there aren't many Hispanics in my specific field, and so I feel like because we aren't well dominated in this category, it doesn't seem like we're meant to be there.
Right. Thank you, Matthew. Personal examples, by the way, are I welcome those. Those often tend to be the ones that I think tend to often rise to the top when we think about some of these issues. Any others on? Yep, go for it.
I have a personal one. Because I'm half Asian. Sometimes when I'm in an area where I'm working with people, sometimes they will even use a racial set of words or context to try to give me a compliment.
Yeah.
In reality, it's not, because they'll be like, "Oh, you're Asian, so you got this math right." And it's kind of like, that's kind of a compliment, but at the same time, it's still racist.
Yeah, that was William, right?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, William. So I'm really glad you shared that, because some folks assume that if you compliment someone, that it's not a racial microaggression. But when that compliment is rooted in a racist stereotype, it is a racial microaggression, right? And let me provide an example of why that's important. So William, you shared if I'm understanding, if I'm sort of following you correctly here, that folks assume that because you identify racially as Asian, that you're automatically good at math, right?
Yes.
Well, what happens if William, we don't know each other. I don't know if you're good at math or not, right? So bear with me.
I'm not.
Okay. Right. And I'm not either, by the way, for what it's worth. But I would imagine that, William being conscious of this stereotype about his racial group, about being good in math, that might have had some impact on his willingness and motivation to ask for help, to seek help for math, right? Because the assumption is that, hey, I'm supposed to be good at this. And so I'm going to be reluctant to ask for help or ask for support when it comes to this, because folks are going to assume that something is wrong with me, right? Because I'm an Asian American who is not good at math, right? It has some implications for help seeking. Now, let's think about what that might look like in the context of health, public health, right? One stereotype that we know that's common amongst men of color is this idea that as a man of color, you're supposed to be tough and independent and strong and you shouldn't need help, right? And so we know because of that stereotype that men of color often really struggle with the idea of seeking therapy and, you know, visiting and are least amongst the least likely to actually seek help for, you know, healthcare problems and healthcare challenges, whether it's mental or physical health, because of this assumed stereotype about the racial ethnic group. And so I know that doesn't necessarily speak directly to an description of intelligence, but I did want to take that as an opportunity to understand how sometimes even we assume that, you know, that we're complimenting someone, it could still be a racial microaggression and still have detrimental consequences for the person who's being microaggressed. Thank you, William. What about assumption of criminality, right? And just to remind you, the assumption of criminality is the microaggression that assumes that a person of color is dangerous, a thug, or someone who's likely to commit a crime based on their identity. How might this manifest in the context of public health? Any ideas here? And I just realized this slide is kind of matching my shirt.
Yeah, I can kind of say something about this one. So I am a Muslim hijab wearing woman and, you know, living in America and just also moved to San Diego. It's something that I feel that kind of happened a bit more than in other places. I emerged in the Bay Area, but that does not to say that the Bay Area does not have its moments, definitely does. So like an assumption criminality could be like, as somebody who wears like a hijab, if I like hold a bag in a certain way, I do get stares. If I move in a certain way, if I raise my tone in a certain way, because I am somebody who identifies and looks like what a Muslim looks like. And unfortunately, when we live in a post 9/11 era, it just got the anti-Islamic sentiments just got worse after that. And we know that Islamophobia is definitely on a rise. So I think like for me, that's like one that I relate to a bit, is just kind of like having to be like on edge because any movement that I do is kind of associated with, sorry about that, kind of like, oh, this person's about to do something, or like I'm scared to be around them type of thing.
Yeah, thank you, Lena. I obviously I think your example is very salient, right? The assumption that you know, people who identify as Muslim or, you know, part of the Muslim faith are likely to be terrorists or, you know, these other sort of disgustingly racist, you know, associations that we have as a result of the 9/11 tragedies. Yeah, I think that's a very salient example. The question I have for you, Lena, and you don't have to answer this if you don't have a response. Any ways in which that might manifest in public health more salient than it might in other ways? Or is it just a socialized fear, right? When you walk into a community or walk into a space that people tend to sort of look at you with suspicion and pause and an unwillingness to maybe engage as readily?
Yeah, so that point exactly that you just made, that last one, we know a big part of like public health is collecting data on certain communities or in certain cities. And if somebody has like biases when it comes to collecting data, are they going to not collect data from like certain communities because of that? And that's why just like more of an emphasis on like the importance of something like this is going into these different places where you've been collecting data and something as that. Like, are you somebody who's open and comfortable with working with different communities? So I think that's like a big part is if you want the data to be accurate, then it needs to be collected from people who do represent that community. And I think that sometimes that as Muslim communities, we are often underlooked because of this.
Yeah, thank you, Lena. I think you're right. So we have a saying in our field that what gets measured gets noticed. And this is why collecting data, right, on health disparities, on educational outcomes is so important, because if we don't have the data, then we're not able to recognize patterns of inequity. And of course, we don't have the policies and the practices and the resources that are invested towards eradicating those disparities. And so especially, you know, I think your example, Lena, is very salient when it comes to collecting qualitative data, like data that's collected by way of interviews and data that's collected by way of focus groups. We know that being able to collect data, right, whether it's health data or education data from people in their own voices, giving folks voice and an opportunity to say, hey, this is what I experienced. And this is how what I'm experiencing is impacting my health and my wellness. That's a very important thing to do. And if there's this socialized fear about a certain community, then researchers may be less likely and less willing to even go and collect data within certain communities in that way. The other point I would make with regard to this microaggression is we say in education that relationships are the foundation, right, of student success. I tried to sort of connect this point to a concept we discussed earlier around the culture of care theory. Relationships, right, between a client and a clinician, or a client and a healthcare provider, or a client and, you know, anyone that's providing a service, relationships are the foundation of success in that relationship. But can you establish a relationship with someone who you fear? Right? An assumption of criminality engenders fear of certain people and of certain communities. And so we have to wonder, what are the long-term implications of fear, right? And what impact might that have on certain communities being served in the way that they should be served, and being engaged proactively from a health perspective in the way that they should be engaged. All right, let's talk about our last microaggression, pathologizing culture. How might this be manifested in the context of public health? And just to remind you, pathologizing culture is where we assume that people of color come from communities that, you know, don't value health or don't value education and so forth. What are the implications there within the context of public health? When we think that a
Hello.
community, yep, sorry, go for it.
Hi, my name's Satara. I'm from North Carolina, very southern part of it, but before coming to San Diego, I did have run-ins a lot whenever I would go to get health care. So my mother, we were from I'll call it an underserved community. And we would travel to get health care. So anytime we would go to this nicer clinic or whatever, anytime they would like ask us the simple questions or whatever, like when was your last checkup or whatever, it was always met with, oh, wow. So you got a checkup last year and you're from, where are you from again? Oh, okay.
So you do care about your health. Oh,
Right.
right. Like kind of
Right.
like that, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because of where we were coming from.
I think that's a great example. Yeah, because sometimes it's based on an assumption of a community being impoverished, right? Sometimes it's based on an assumption of a community having a high concentration of families of color, sometimes both, oftentimes both, right?
Right.
And then what do we think are the implications, right, for how someone might treat a client who is assumed to come from a community that doesn't value health?
I'm sorry, can you ask that again? It kind of cut out.
Yeah, of course. And I wasn't asking, you know, you specifically, Satara, but you're welcome to answer. Yeah, but this is for anybody who may wish to answer. How might a healthcare professional, family, or treat a
Dr. Harris? Did we lose you?
I'm still here. You hear me?
Okay, there you are.
I have an example.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, go for it, William.
So one time, okay, so when I was in the military, I got really, really sick, and I went to of course, the military hospital. And of course, as soon as the physician's assistant found out that I was a gay man, they automatically started to assume that because the culture of gay men are supposedly always very, always have like unprotected sex, we're filled with AIDS, all this stigma. I realized that as a gay person and talking to my other gay friends who went to that same hospital to get treatment, they wouldn't take us seriously. And the first thing they would do is ask us sexual questions like, when's the last time you had sex? And just assume we had STDs and they'd automatically get an AIDS checkup on us. And I was thinking, look, I haven't had sex in the last 4 months. Why do you keep thinking I have an STD or something when those symptoms doesn't match anything what I'm trying to tell you? So I feel like culturally speaking, my healthcare was sometimes stigmatized because I'm a gay person.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that experience. I'm sorry that you've had that experience. But I think the example you share, William, I mean, certainly, right, your health was compromised in that situation. And this is why, again, right, this is why we're having this conversation. Because again, these issues lead to long-term health disparities, right? It's all connected, it's all related. And this is why we have to be not just aware, but hyper aware as professionals, first and foremost, with what assumptions might we have about certain communities, right? And how might that impact the way we, in my case, teach them, in your case, serve them. And we need to be aware so that we could take leadership in being able to change things, to address these issues. And so, given that, I want to sort of end our conversation with how do we address racial microaggressions? How do we address all the stuff, racial battle fatigue, all the stuff that we've been talking about today? What do we do about it? And what in doing so, at least as it relates specifically to racial microaggressions, I want to introduce you to a framework that my colleague, Dr. J. Luke Woods, some of you may know him, but Luke is now the Vice President for Student Affairs and Campus Diversity. But before he assumed that role, he was a faculty member. He and I co-direct the Community College Equity Assessment Lab. And one time, Luke and I were going to do some work, do some training at a college. The training focused on microaggressions, and the college said, hey, we don't want you to just teach us about microaggressions, but we want you to give us a tool or some kind of framework to be able to respond effectively to them. And so what we did, we did what any good researcher would do. We looked at the published literature and sort of saw what was out there. And what we found was that there was a lot in the literature on identifying microaggressions. There was a lot on being able to say how they're consequential, and much like the conversation we had today, but very little on how to respond to them. And so what we did, we took the best of what we saw, and we developed this framework called the Raven that I'm going to introduce you to. And we find that the Raven tends to work best, right? It doesn't address every microaggression in every situation, but it tends to work best in addressing those that are expressed verbally or in text and in a public setting, say when 3 or more people are present. And it also works well, maybe to a lesser degree, in addressing environmental microaggressions online. Now, and also I will say this, one limitation of the Raven is that it doesn't work as well when there's a power differential, right? Say between student and professor, or supervisory and supervisor, right? I don't think it works as well in that situation. But let me introduce you to it, and we'll see what it looks like. So the Raven, we call it the Raven because each letter of the word Raven stands for one key step. The Raven is a 5-step process. And the first step, so let's say you're working at a community health center, you're working at a campus health clinic, whatever it may be, and you overhear a colleague or someone microaggressing a client or microaggressing another colleague. We say the first thing you have to do is to redirect by interrupting that interaction, pulling the person aside. doing something that stops further harm from taking place, right? And there's a lot of different ways you can say, hey, Frank, I'm sorry, we have an emergency. I need to talk to you really quickly, right? But you got to kind of stop it from happening in the moment. That's the very first thing you have to do. The second step is to do what we call asking probing questions for clarity. So the key with this step is that you want to get the person to pause, to reflect, and to begin to think critically about what they're saying. One thing we didn't talk about today is that oftentimes racial microaggressions are rooted in our implicit bias. And I think Professor Casares talked with you all, if I understand correctly, last week about implicit bias. Well, oftentimes microaggressions emerge from our implicit bias, from our, the names that we're not, assumptions that we're not even aware that we have oftentimes. But anyway, with this step, we want to accomplish two things. We want to give the person a chance to stop and clarify what they may have said, because sometimes we misunderstand things, or sometimes we misinterpret things that we may have heard. They may have thought we heard, but we may not have heard, right? So when they say, hey, I think I heard you say this to that client, what exactly did you mean by that, right? Or I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Are you suggesting, right? And so this step gives you an opportunity to seek clarity. Next, we want to engage in a clarification of values. Now, here's what we have to understand. We cannot clarify values that we don't have. And so I often say, so when I'm doing a training at a college or a university, and I'm doing a training with a set of institutional leaders, I say it's important that there is that everyone at this institution or everyone at this department is committed to a set of shared values, right? That we all value these same things, and that we've transparently and publicly sort of committed to them. Because sometimes this is going to be your best resource when you want to address some of racial microaggression. And the way that we do this is we remind the person that what they have said or what they have done is not appropriate and is not aligned with the values of our community, our workplace, whatever it may be, right? So we were saying, in this department, we make sure that we create a space that's safe and welcoming for all of our clients. And the ways in which you engage that client or the ways in which you spoke with that client is not aligned with those values that we've all agreed to commit to, right? As professionals working in this space. Next, we have to emphasize our own thoughts and feelings, right? Now, this step is important because oftentimes others may assume that the person who's the target of the microaggression is the only person that was harmed by it, when in fact, those who observe it and overhear it are also harmed by it. And so it's important to personalize your own feelings and to be transparent about this. But when I hear you make a comment like that, or when I hear you treat a client that way, I'm offended by it and I'm uncomfortable with it and I have a problem with it for this reason, right? So it's not just about the person who was on the receiving end, but it's about how it made me feel as well, and how it likely made others feel who may have overheard it. And then the last point is that we always want to end these conversations with some sort of constructive feedback. Give the person some guidance on how they should act the next time. Give them some resources, give them some next steps, right? Now, keep this in mind. You don't have to follow these steps exactly as they're laid out, right? So the Raven is really more of a framework to guide your thinking and to guide action. It's not about following these steps exactly as they're laid out here. And another thing, you might accomplish more than one of these things with one statement. So for example, you might engage in a values clarification after you've emphasized your own thoughts and feelings, or you might make one statement that does both at the same time, right? So it's not about following this rigid process, but what this does is it gives us a tool, because oftentimes folks say that, hey, I overheard it. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was problematic, but I didn't say anything because I didn't really know what to say or how to respond. And so this framework gives you a tool to be able to sort of get past that initial moment of surprise and feeling, sort of frozen, and being able to sort of address it constructively and responsibly. And so I know we have about 10 minutes remaining, so I do want to leave you with some strategies and some next steps, and then this should give us about 5 more minutes for any final thoughts. But I think as emerging health professionals, We have a responsibility to learn about racial microaggressions. You've already kind of done that today. You've already had conversations about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And racial microaggressions is all a part of the same framework. I would say continue to learn, continue to read, continue to build your capacity to be effective in not only microaggressing other people, but also being able to respond to them when you overhear them. Second is establishing a model community norms. This is really important, right? Because once everyone understands, what racial microaggressions are, how easy they are to commit and how dangerous they can be, we have to establish a set of norms that they're not acceptable. And we have to model these norms on a consistent basis, right? And in a collegial and a constructive way, call out those who violate them. And sometimes these norms and these values are going to be, your saving grace and what you have to reference when you want to respond to a microaggression. We also have to acknowledge the realities of race. We started this conversation by acknowledging we're living in a very racially salient time right now. What that means is that there's likely going to be more issues and incidences of race that are racially motivated, especially in the current political climate, which tends to be very anti-immigrant and very anti-minority. And so we just have to expect things to be more prevalent and be ready to respond when they happen. We have to convey authentic care and high expectations, right? I often tell our faculty members who I'm working with is that you have to care about your students and you have to consistently communicate high expectations of your students. And so when that's our default, right? When we challenge ourselves to do that, then we're less likely to microaggress someone, right? Because again, microaggressions are often rooted in the implicit and low expectations that we might have about a community, about someone. We have to embrace opportunities for meaningful cross-racial interaction. Again, making sure that we are embracing opportunities to be with people who are racially different from us. It's not only helpful as it relates to microaggressions, but it helps us grow and mature as better people. We're living in a society that's becoming increasingly diverse and multicultural. And so being able to engage meaningfully across race, it's an important life skill, especially as someone who's going into the public health field, right? You have to be able to work with communities and families and clients that are racially different from you. We're all gonna make mistakes. Sometimes we say things and do things that it's not the best reflection of who we are or who we wanna be. When it happens, we have to own it, take ownership, don't avoid it, don't become defensive, but we really have to be humble and assume some personal accountability when this happens. And then lastly, I understand that Professor Casares is going to be teaching a health equity course next semester, Public Health 496. And so I would encourage you to take it, again, as a part of continue to build your capacity to be an equity-minded, race-conscious public health professional. And with that, I want to thank you all for having me. Thank you for allowing me to come into your space today and share some ideas, share some things that I hope you found helpful. And I think looks like we have about 7 minutes or so for questions. So I'll be happy to engage in any question. It doesn't have to be questions. It could also be, thoughts and reflections, any reactions to what we shared today as well. Thank you all so much.
I have something to add about the question that you asked earlier about how you think providers would treat their patients and clients if they feel like they don't themselves care about their own health. I've seen it firsthand where physicians, they do make that assumption and therefore patients really do suffer, like they don't get the proper labs that they need done. They don't go to the extent that they would with a patient that they did assume did take care of themselves, which then I believe leads, towards even greater health inequity because they're not getting the proper care that they need because of an assumption. And, the patient might have diabetes and is showing symptoms of diabetes, but isn't getting treated as such, getting, treated for something less, serious. And then next thing you know, they need like a foot amputation.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. As you were sharing 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 that experience, and it reminded me of an issue that's become more. I don't want to say it's becoming more prevalent, but there's certainly been a lot more awareness around the number of Black women. There's a high percentage of Black women who actually die during childbirth. That Serena Williams actually is someone who almost experienced that, and it's really launched a public platform to make folks understand and be more aware of it. And so, as folks have sort of looked deeper into the issue, there's certainly data that sort of speaks to this, and all of it is rooted in the implicit assumptions that clinicians and other health professionals make about Black women, about Black women as mothers, and all sorts of things that have some consequential implications for not only the health of the mothers, right, but also the health of the unborn child or the soon-to-be child. And so, again, this is why the conversation we're having today is so important, because we have to raise our awareness about how these implicit and things that appear to be subtle, how they can be they could have life or death consequences for so many people. And it's typically communities of color, women of color, right, lower income communities that often suffer as a result of this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, of course, thank you. Yep, happy to be here. Thank you, Jordan. Any others, thoughts or reactions or questions?
Hi, I just wanted to say that I work as an RA, so we get like a lot of diversity training and we sit through like a lot of presentations like this. But yours is definitely like my favorite presentation that I've ever got to sit through. I feel like it was really digestible and you made a lot of kind of like really difficult concepts make sense. And I just really appreciate it and I really loved it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Nikki. Yeah, I try. Sometimes they go well, sometimes, right, not as well as you hope. But I just hope everyone is walking away with at least another tool in their toolkit as you move forward in your career as health professionals, public health professionals. Any other thoughts or anything else before we conclude? Well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. Thank you again for having me, Professor Casares. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation. Hope we can do it again. You know how to find me if you think I can contribute to. Yeah, but I really appreciated this opportunity.
Yes, Dr. Harris, that was amazing. Can I see some clapping hands and some waving hands here? I mean, seriously, this was, like Nikki said, so jam-packed, but also laid out in a very, digestible, understandable way. So I think it's just the start for many, and that's okay. And there's going to be more, and it's an ongoing process. But what you have shared with us today, I think is really resonating. And I think to see the association of the importance of this work and public health and healthcare, and how it plays out, that was very powerful. The questions and posing the questions to the students about how it manifests, the different microaggressions. I mean, so relevant. So thank you for that. And we will definitely be calling on you maybe later on in the semester. So
yeah, absolutely. Anytime. Thank you. I enjoyed it. I'll share the slides again because students may want to use it for their upcoming presentations. So feel free to use it as a resource. And thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And so with that, I'm going to let Dr. Harris go. Bye, Dr. Harris. Thank you. And then, just like I said earlier, I will send out the different resources I mentioned today. So I'll get that tonight. And again, if you have any questions, just reach out to us. In terms of this conversation, I think what I'd like to do is maybe create a discussion in Canvas. I really think that it's going to be important to process what you've learned and heard today. That's one good step that you can make on this learning journey, is by reflecting every time you learn. So whatever you learned about today, or whatever stood out, or whatever's coming up for you, feelings, I highly encourage you to journal about it. And so I will add to the chat a new discussion around this topic, and feel free to just be honest and share what you're thinking and feeling, and any questions that you have, and anything that you want in terms of additional resources. I'm happy to provide those as well. Okay. Other than that, have a good rest of your night. Unless you have questions, you can hang out here for a little while. I'll hang out here if people want to chat or talk about the project or anything. I'll hang out a little while longer. I think Allison if can hang out maybe a few more minutes. Okay, great. So yeah, hang out, and if you have questions or want to chat with each other about anything, the group project or any of the assignments, feel free to stay. Okay, Allison, I'll be. Oh, thanks.
Sounds good. Do we want to keep the recording going, or are we?
Oh yeah, you can pause it.
I don't think I have the option to do that.
Okay, let me see.